On Issues and Insiders today, we meet with the New York Times best-selling author of children's fantasy books for her thoughts on her current career, as well as a former professional endeavors. Do stay tuned. Hello and welcome. You're watching yet another edition of Issues and Insiders. I'm Min Sunhee. Today, I have the pleasure of speaking with a jack of many trades, if I may, ranging from diplomacy to cooking to writing. I have Graci Kim live on the line from New Zealand. Gracie, welcome to the program.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
Most welcome. Gracie, you have an amazing career portfolio, if I may say so myself. And that being said, could you walk us through your professional pursuits, starting perhaps with, of course, your departure from South Korea?
Sure. So I moved to New Zealand with my family when I was 3 years old. So there wasn't a lot of professional activity happening for my schooling career. I did most of my degree in New Zealand, a stint in Spain, and then I got a job in the Department of Internal Affairs in New Zealand. From there, I went to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and I was a New Zealand diplomat for over a decade. But alongside my diplomatic job, I was a little restless. So I did various things. I once created a creative tech business, creating interactive children's books for the iPad. I created an online cooking show that made it onto the Food Network and the Taste Made Network. At one point, I even created a business that turned children's drawings into soft toys. But when eventually, after my postings and my diplomatic career ended and I returned to New Zealand, I began writing, which is what I am loving and enjoying today.
Right. And let's talk about writing then. Gracie, what prompted this professional endeavor and what were some of the early lessons learned while exploring, that is, your literary talent?
It's a very good question. The long story short is that one day I was working at the New Zealand Embassy in Beijing and I went in and I couldn't read my emails. And so I went to get my eyes checked and basically the ophthalmologist, she sat me down and she said, Gracie, if you don't get emergency eye surgery within the next 24 to 72 hours, you'll be blind. And so I had this very shocking experience. And after the surgery for months afterwards, I had no sight while I was waiting for, hopefully, my sight to come back. And so during this time, I really thought about my life and the direction I wanted to take it and what kind of legacy I would be eventually leaving behind. And I decided to write because I had loved books growing up, but I had never seen myself reflected in them. And I think books are windows into other people's journeys and other people's walks of life, but they should also sometimes be mirrors. And I wanted kids like me to be able to see themselves reflected on the page.
Right. Gracie, what would you say was some of the most perhaps constructive criticism that you received earlier on in your career as a writer?
You know, the first book I ever wrote, I entered a mentoring program with it. And I was so proud of this piece of writing. I thought I had written something great. And you know, this mentor, she was so wonderful. She wrote back and she said, look, you've got something here in terms of your general writing, but this manuscript, it ain't it. Throw it away and start afresh. And it was so tough to hear because I had poured my blood and sweat and tears into this. But it was the best feedback I believe that I received. And it was the next thing that I wrote after that that became my first published book.
Right. And that next thing was the Gifted Clan series, right? Gracie,
exactly.
What would you say was the inspiration behind that particular series? And how long did it take you to finish the first book?
Oh, okay. So I would say there were three big inspirations. So one was my love for my sisters. Our strong sisterhood was something I wanted to explore. The second thing was the strong value I have that we don't have to choose between different parts of our identity. Just because I grew up in New Zealand doesn't mean that I'm any less Korean, and just because I am Korean doesn't make me any less Kiwi. We're not math equations. We can be 100% of all our various identities. So that feeling of feeling stuck and that belonging and acceptance starts with ourselves. That was something I also wanted to explore. But also it was the myth of the bear and the tiger who both wanted to become human. They pray to their God, and the story goes that they go into this cave with garlic and mugwort leaves, and the tiger can't do it, but the bear can, and then the bear turns into a Korean woman. So this idea that if they continue to live today, who would they be? Would they have, hidden magical powers? What if they immigrated to places like LA? What would their lives look like? And so that first book I would say the first draft took about 6 months, but then I revised it for 3 years.
Wow, Gracie, that's amazing. I understand this book was also published during the pandemic.
Yes.
How did that affect your advertising, perhaps, of the book?
Oh, look, it was really hard. I was supposed to go on this incredible book tour around the world and meet fans and share this thing that I had somehow managed to create with the people at Disney. And I couldn't go. I was stuck at home in my pajamas. And I was sad about it for a while. But we actually ended up doing this fun thing where I couldn't go on physical tour. So I put this funny face cutout online, and I invited people to print me out and stick me on like a popsicle stick and take me on virtual tour. And so I got lots of photos and videos of people holding up my face at bookstores. And it was actually, I would say, even more fun than an in-person tour.
Right. Gracie, what was it like when the Last Fallen Star hit the New York Times bestseller list? How do you explain the popularity of that book, which was the first in the trilogy, right?
Yes. Honestly, I will say it was no short of magic because, like I said, COVID happened and the world was in a very strange place. And the other thing that was quite remarkable, I think, is that the book didn't hit the list when the book first came out, which is when normally books hit the New York Times bestseller list. It was an entire year afterwards that it did. And so I can only explain it as sheer magic. And I'm just so grateful and honestly so excited to be able to share the story with new readers all the time.
Gracie, have you ever experienced writer's block, especially when working on the Gifted Clan series? And if that is the case, how did you personally seek to overcome it?
I think there's 2 types of writer's block. So I think the first writer's block is not real. That just means you have to do the hard work of putting your bottom in the chair and just getting the words out. Like there's that writer's block, which people use it as an excuse. And for that, I think there's no way to solve it. You just got to sit in the chair. The second writer's block, I think, is real writer's block. And I think for that, it just means that your creative bucket is empty. And so for that, I think, for me anyway, I need to fill my creative bucket. That might involve reading other books, watching other shows or movies, experiencing life, like taking some time and spend time with your friends and your family, ask questions, be curious, go out in nature, just live. So I think once you fill that creative bucket, then you have more that you can draw from, be inspired by, and use as inputs to create output. And I think that to me is a way of solving the real writer's block problem.
You mentioned earlier about how your first career, of course, was in diplomacy. Do you suppose your experience within the field of diplomacy served as a source, perhaps, for your creative bucket as well?
Absolutely. And not just the creative part, but actually training. Because in diplomacy, we write reports and cables, formal messages for our capitals. And it's a very daunting process when you first join. Sometimes your every punctuation mark is edited by multiple people. And so you grow a very thick skin in editing your work and not being precious about your words. And I have to say that specifically has been one of the best skills I have applied to writing as well.
And Gracie, staying with diplomacy, I understand your first job was over in Shanghai, China.
It was actually in Beijing. I was in Taipei and then later on in Beijing. Yeah.
Tell us a bit about that.
It was a wonderful experience. I think the coolest thing about being a diplomat is, well, for me personally, was that I could represent my country, New Zealand, the country that gave me my education and my upbringing. But because of the way I look, I always could represent my Korean identity as well. I could always tell the story of my roots and my upbringing. And so the ability to go to a place like China, that was even doubly so because people's assumption was that I was of Chinese heritage. So I could always tell the story of my Korean identity as well as my Kiwi. And you know what I love about that in particular is that even though I've left diplomacy now, I feel like through my work, I'm still doing diplomacy. I recently did a tour to Korea at the invitation of the New Zealand embassy, and it was really fostering the literary links between New Zealand and Korea. So I think diplomacy can be done in many ways.
And speaking about many ways, I understand you also, like you mentioned earlier, of course, you're a cooking show host. And I personally, Gracie, loved your concept of mood-based cooking. For the sake of our viewers, could you explain to us this concept?
Sure. So the idea was that instead of just eating things because you crave a certain ingredient, what if there were meals designed to suit the specific mood you were in? You know, so if you're feeling heartbroken, what you should eat and why, or if you're feeling nervous, what you should eat and why, because food has so many, not just nutritional, but scientific and emotional properties. In fact, I love this idea so much that this new series I have starting next year called Dream Slinger, there is a concept of mood menu inside this book.
I see. And what would you recommend then, Gracie, as a menu for a sweltering summer day, which is going to be the case here in Korea in the next few days?
I would say something really spicy, like a spicy broth, like a tom yum Thai soup, or even just like a Korean jjigae, because capsaicin, which is in the chili, what makes it spicy, that releases into your body, and it actually helps to increase blood flow, and then helps you sweat, which then cools you down. It also increases appetite, and you know, the other thing is that it makes you thirsty, and so you drink more water. So maybe perhaps with a side of cold watermelon juice with ice.
This sounds delicious. Gracie, do you suppose that the recent global interest in K-entertainment, including its movies and its music and dramas, perhaps, has also shed greater light, perhaps, on your work as a writer?
Absolutely. I remember, you know, going to school as a primary school kid and having to be very careful about what I share about my love of K-pop and K-dramas with my friends because I'd be teased for it, would you believe? And I think now the opposite is true. There is this wonderful hunger and thirst for our creative Korean talent and creativity and our stories. And you know what? I can't explain why and how, but I'm just so grateful and honored to be a part of the wider movement.
Do you suppose that the government here could serve to do more, perhaps, to promote this global interest in the Korean culture through people like yourself, of course?
Oh, I mean, I would be biased, of course, but I would say yes, absolutely. There's always so much more we can do to bolster voices and to share all the fun stuff. I would say there is so much more going on in the world than we're aware of. And so any support to strengthen our voices and to share our creativity would be so well received.
Moving forward, Gracie, what started your toy-making business, which was prior to your career as a writer, of course, right?
Yes, it was. I'll tell you, it's a funny story. I was in a terribly boring meeting, a diplomatic meeting about trade subsidies. And I was doodling in my notebook and thinking, gosh, the only thing that could make this meeting less painful is if one of these doodles jumped out of the page and started dancing on the table. And I thought, you know what, that's a great idea. What if I could work with artisans and people young and old could send us their little doodles and we could turn them to life, bring them to life into the form of real life cuddly toys. Imagine how people would feel seeing their imaginations come to life. And that's how it started. And it was so much fun. And if I learned anything, it is that if you can imagine it, you're halfway there to making it a reality. And I really did believe through this that if I could help people's imaginations come to life in this very small way, perhaps I could even bring my own imagination to life in the form of books.
Which is why you started writing then?
Exactly.
And Gracie, back to writing then. What advice do you care to share for any first-time writer?
You know, the great thing about writing is that there is no qualification, there's no degree, there's no permission you need from anyone to write. If you want to write, you are a writer. So the only thing left to do is pick up the pen, or in today's society, pick up your laptop, and write. And I think the only thing you really need to do is keep writing, keep reading. I think that is so important. We learn so much by osmosis by reading. And then finally, the most important is to seek feedback. I think the only way we can learn and improve our craft is to have feedback, to take what resonates and to revise and revise and revise. My first book, The Last Fallen Star, went through about 14 to 17 rewrites before it became the published version. And so I would say have perseverance and just keep writing.
Right. And Gracie, before we end today, perhaps a few words from you about your plans for the rest of this year.
I am heavily working on my next series. I mentioned before, it's called Dream Slinger. It's also inspired by lots of Korean mythology, but in a slightly different way to the Gifted Clans trilogy. It's about a world, I'm kind of pitching it as X-Men meets Pokemon, if you can kind of see that. So it's about a subsection of the population that is born with a genetic mutation called the Dream Slinger gene that allows them to travel physically into their dreams. It's full of incredible magic, also deadly magic. And the main character, Arya, her mother was killed by a dream slinger attack. And so she enters the annual slinger trials in the royal kingdom of Hanguk to tear the organization down from the inside. But in doing so, learns a lot about her magic and herself and her history than she had bargained for. It comes out in April next year, and I'm very excited editing and planning marketing and fun stuff like that.
And we shall be looking forward to that book, Gracie. Thank you so much for making time to speak to us live today.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It's been a great pleasure.
Right, you're most welcome. All right then, well, that is all the time we have for this edition of Issues and Insiders. Thank you for watching.